Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we are going to revisit a hot topic, a political topic even. That is the memory of the Second World War. Today, we're going to look at the legacy of how World War II is remembered, commemorated, used and abused, and even enlisted on the political battlefield in the Allied Big Three, the USSR, the US, and the UK. Hi, Jesse. Good to be back. Another week, another podcast, this time again on commemoration, on memories and legacy. We looked at it in a previous episode for Germany. So this side, the other side of the hill, so to speak, the big three, as we just said, the big Allied three. So there is a lot to go through. So perhaps without much further ado, because otherwise we'll be running out of time as we always do, because there's always so much to talk about, dear listeners. There's so much that we need to get across to you, because otherwise our heads will just burst and explode because they're so full with stuff. We just need to get it out there. So, and now I've rambled on for about a minute. So basically killing some time here. Jesse, let's talk about perhaps the USSR/Russia, however we want to play this, as the first big player.
Yes.
What do you think when we look at the legacy, the memories, all these things? What do you think is perhaps the most important, or the most important points, aspects that we can find when we look at this particular country, or countries, we should say, because of course the USSR doesn't exist anymore as such.
That is true. What a shame. I mean, I don't know if I can get the sarcasm through there, but
it was
anyway.
Much easier in those days. Yeah.
Just a very quick reminder for our listeners before we dive straight into the USSR/Russia, its primary successor state as far as the memory of World War II is concerned in any case, or membership on the UN's Permanent Security Council, whichever you want to go with. When we talk about historical memory, it's not, an individual person's memory of having been alive at a certain time and what happened. It's that process of how does a society think about something that happened in the past? How does it understand it? What kind of meaning or uses does it attach to its interpretation of that thing in the past? In this case, World War II. So I find the Soviet and Russian case one of the most interesting because it's one of the most relevant. And yes, this is going to take us to mentioning some examples of the current war between Russia and Ukraine. But let me start a little bit earlier than that. One of the aspects I find most interesting is that, of course, the Soviet Union played, this is somewhat arguable, but I think Matthias and I, we probably see this a bit similarly. The Soviet Union probably played, the primary role in the defeat of Germany. There are lots of caveats. There are lots of other, aspects to that. They didn't do it alone. But they were the state that played the largest role in the defeat of Germany in Europe, in my opinion. Now, what I find interesting about that is that war came about even though the Soviet Union was allied to Germany from 1939 to 1941. And it gives the Soviet Union a kind of reason for being, a historical purpose in life after World War II. So if you think about the 1930s in the Soviet Union, it's 20s and 30s are a very difficult time. The state is destroying all of the institutions, social and government, from the old order. They're collectivizing the farms, they're nationalizing the factories, they're deporting people into gulags, they're purging and executing. They destroy all the normal things that keep a society together, that make a society think, yeah, we belong together and we have these connections in our world, in our shared kind of national world. But World War II kind of gives the Soviet state a new, I'm going to use a fancy French word here, folks, raison d'être. It gives it a new meaning. They're like, well, of course, we had to do all that stuff because it prepared us for defeating fascism. And that's the USSR's role in history. And it's interesting that at a time when the USSR was starting to kind of stagnate and lose its way in the 60s and 70s under Brezhnev, this is when commemoration of World War II starts to become more and more prominent. The government puts a lot more emphasis on commemorating veterans and parades and this sort of thing when the state is not doing well in the 60s and 70s. So it's a kind of a way of saying, yeah, life is, we don't know where we're going now. And the Soviet Union is not providing much in the way of meaning for its citizens in the 1970s. But look at what we did in 1941 to 1945. That's why we are who we are. That's our meaning, the meaning of our history. And so I thought that was a really interesting kind of wave that came in the Soviet Union of using the history for something, right? I don't know if you see the developments in the Soviet Union in a similar light, but that's one thing that really struck me.
You're absolutely right. Well, the whole question or the whole matter of history, of memory, of remembering, commemorating, normally tends to go in waves. It does not only apply to the Soviet Union, but basically to every country. And quite often you have a trigger which changes the way we commemorate things as nations, as people, as human beings. And you've already mentioned one here that is really important for the Soviet Union. When you go back a little bit and look at the time after 1945, till these days in the 60s, where, as you've already said, things change because of changes within the Soviet Union. It's really interesting to see that the Second World War, yes, it's there, yes, it's talked about, but that mainly happens within families, amongst, well, groups of people who fought together. There is not a lot of, let's call it state, well, for a better term, propaganda that comes out at this particular time. That's really quite striking. So you have the big victory parade in 1945. Listeners, you might have seen this on YouTube or video. If not, just Google it. You can see the Soviet soldiers parading down the Red Square in Moscow. They're throwing down the German banners and standards, and basically you can see where the fascist beast has been defeated. Then you've got Zhukov riding down on the White Stallion, very, very famous scene.
Classic.
That actually cheesed off Stalin because he wanted to take this parade, but he's not such a good rider. So he was thrown a number of times. So in the end, the honor goes to Zhukov, the famous field marshal. And of course, because he was getting a bit too popular with the troops, he then gets posted to Siberia. So never getting a White Stallion in front of Stalin doesn't bode well, to be perfectly honest. But that's basically it. So after this is over, you can see, well, you know what? We've done it. We've defeated. Now, we as the Soviets, we've defeated the Germans. The world can see this. It's done. You have the Potsdam Conference in which Russia or the Soviet Union gets basically what they want. You can also say this is where they begin to spread or have now spread the socialist/communist sphere of influence. So going back to the idea of Lenin in the 1910s and early 1920s before he dies. So you can see tick in the box, that all worked really, really well. And after that, till the 1960s, the whole official legacy memory commemoration doesn't really exist. It's quite striking because they say now we need to be looking forward. We need to be going forward with our future. We are rebuilding our country. We are rebuilding, well, basically all of Eastern Europe. It's time for a new regime, a new society. So looking back even to World War II, there is not much point in doing that. And what, as you already said, is really quite striking. 1960s, things are not going well. Of course, you also have the phase of de-Stalinization before that. And suddenly, the Second World War takes center stage. And I would probably say never really loses it. Again, it goes up and down in waves. And we're going to look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. But when you look at recent events, again, the importance of World War II has been elevated once again to a level which you might say is, well, I wouldn't say unbelievable because it's happening, but is quite striking. It's quite striking to see what's going on in Russia. What do you think, Jesse?
Well, as far as the Soviet side of the story is concerned, another, memory is about remembering things and it's about forgetting things. So what do we choose decades after the fact to emphasize and to commemorate? And what do we choose to not focus on? These are kind of the two sides of the making that meaning, attaching the significance to something, emotional, political, whatever. And the Soviets, of course, do this as well. And what I find striking is the stuff that they don't focus on, that kind of gets pushed aside a little bit. For example, differences in how different groups of people in the Soviet Union experienced the Second World War. those get absolutely papered over. It's as though they almost don't exist. So the contributions of non-Russians tend to be a little bit less emphasized. This is something that comes a lot more after the end of the Soviet Union as well. But prisoners of war, as an example, right? So officially, according to the Soviet Union, they are sort of traitors because they surrendered, and they're not allowed to participate in the veterans organizations. They're not allowed to march in the parades. They don't get the same kind of pensions. They often get visits from the internal security forces because they're suspected to have been tainted by having been exposed to fascist society. So this memory of the Soviet Union, this great victory, excludes several million people who suffered and sacrificed to buy their country time, essentially, to organize itself and recover and then win the war. Another group that's not really talked about are the Soviet women who were victims of rape by the German and allied to Germany occupying forces. It's not something that gets talked about anyway, but especially in the Soviet Union, you don't want to emphasize that. You don't want to admit that this widespread rape occurred, or the system of like sex slavery in the occupied Soviet Union. This is something that, as the Soviets, they don't want to admit. They don't really bring it up at the Nuremberg trials as a war crime, although in theory they could have. They don't want the humiliation. They don't want to say, yeah, this happened and those women are still there, right? So that's another big group of people, several million people, who are just left out of the memory of the Second World War. And of course, then there's the whole question of collaboration, which just isn't dealt with in the Soviet memory. There's a little bit of talk, of course, there were some bad Ukrainian nationalists who collaborated with the Germans, or bad Lithuanian nationalists, or what have you. But for example, the several 100,000 Russians who worked with the German army, and then several tens of thousands who joined a formation in the German army, the Vlasov army, they're also they're way on the edge. We don't really talk about them. We don't really want to tackle that bull by the horns, that we had different experiences. Or the deportations of Chechens, for example, or Ingushetians, other kind of Caucasian peoples who Stalin suspected of collaborating with the Germans, even though there wasn't that much collaboration during the brief German occupation of the North Caucasus. So that mixture of, we're focusing on it, it's super important, except for those parts. We're not gonna talk about those things. Right? So that kind of balance is an interesting one. All countries do it, but that's a bit of the Soviet side. It gets a lot more dramatic in the last 10 or 15 years in Russia, but maybe you ease us into that period as well.
But of course, there's also a question of ideology when you talk about specific groups. The official view in the Soviet Union, at least, was that they wouldn't take a specific group and make them the martyrs, the group that suffered most or had done most to defeat the Germans. Because that would be wrong from a communist idea where it's all about class rather than nationality or race or something like this. This is also the official reason why, for example, in the Soviet Union, the Holocaust, the killing of the Jews, did not get a special status, let's say, as it has got in Western countries. So that didn't happen. That's the official reason. There might be other underlying reasons as well. Yes, you've got Russians as the strongest nation within the Soviet Union. Racism might play a role as well. So different factors that can factor in there as well. You also have internal political fractions, of course. You already mentioned some of these. I thought it was quite striking when a few years ago I went to Moscow when we still could do this, and we were, I wouldn't say friends, but we weren't talking terms. Going to two museums in Moscow that basically commemorate, analyze, look at whatever you want to call it, the Second World War. In the first one, as we went in, that was under the control, strange enough, so I was told, of the Foreign Ministry. And the Vlasov army that you mentioned wasn't mentioned at all. It wasn't mentioned because they are the traitors. You shouldn't even talk about them. They shouldn't be remembered. We then went to the army that commemorates the museum that commemorates the Second World War. And our tour guide told us that army was under the guidance of the Ministry of Defense. And strangely enough, in there you had a display of the Vlasov army. And they did say, well, these were traitors and fighting against the cause of the motherland, but they did mention them. And I asked him, he said, why is that? That here you can talk about this, but not in the other one. He said, well, because this is internal, so this is for Russian consumption. So, but to the outside world, we can still create a united front. So I thought that was really quite interesting. And again, it shows you some of these tensions that you find in there. But if we go back, and so let's use an example. Let's go, for example, to Stalingrad. I mean, I think we've both been to Stalingrad. We've seen it.
Yeah.
When you see the memorial park at the Mamayev Kurgan, it is absolutely striking. It's the best example of, you might say, 1960s Soviet style memory. And you look at these huge figures that they built. We talked about Stalingrad in a different episode. And when you look at the Mother Russia, the big statue that they built there, at the time it was built, it was the tallest freestanding statue in the world. It holds up a sword. And when you include the sword, it's about twice the size of the Statue of Liberty. It's absolutely huge. And the figures are very, very, you might say, socialist and communist. It really sends out a very, very strong picture. And when I bring this forward now, because we need to move on a little bit, if we'll now jump to the present day, perhaps, so from the collapse of the Soviet Union all the way to today. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, that's the dark time for, let's stick with Russia, for Russia and the other countries as well. And Putin, when you look at him, he says, well, this is the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's really interesting how they perceive these things. It's also interesting when you then look at how they then move back again in times of need, you might say. And you talked about this earlier, Jesse, when times are dire, you go back to World War II to remember this. And this happens now, and you look at what goes on right now. So it's interesting how important World War II is. I come back to the example of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, of course, then renamed Volgograd. So Stalin's city becomes the city on the river Volga. But now, for a few days every year, it officially goes back to being called Stalingrad. That's absolutely amazing. So officially, the city changes its name again to Stalingrad. So the name it had during the Second World War, of course, Stalin's city, which was renamed into the city on the Volga, goes back to carrying Stalin's name for a few days a year. This is an extremely strong statement, and you can see why they're doing it. It's, again, to get this idea, the legacy, the memory of World War II, the great deeds that the Soviets performed in defeating the fascist beast. So very, very striking, very, very strong. And it's also interesting, you can link this to some polls, and you see, well, what do people in Russia, for example, think about Stalin? And when you can believe these polls, particularly the young people, now they say, you know what, it wasn't all that bad under Stalin. It was a strong, powerful country. We were respected. We won the war. All these things coming together. And when you talk to Russians, they say that they won the war single-handedly. We've talked about this big debate. The UK sometimes think it won the war single-handedly. The Americans think it, the Soviets as well. Having talked to some Russian, also veterans, they actually believed that the Western allies were working against the Russians. When you then point out that, well, you received hundreds of thousands of vehicles and tanks and planes and all these things, they don't want to believe this. But that's a very different story. Again, memory can be quite selective.
Yeah, I think, look, let's not kid ourselves, right? We're not trying to be partisan, but obviously Russia today feels like it's on a mission politically, militarily. It's trying to expand its territory. It very openly says, we're fighting against the West, and what we see is a Western world order represented by Ukraine for now. And they enlist World War II in this, I don't think it's an exaggeration to call it a crusade, because there's lots of religious symbolism and language that's also being used in Russia at the moment. But under Putin, World War II again really gets a boost of steroids as far as its meaning is concerned in his project for a new Russian empire, essentially. You see local celebrations, kids are dressed up in uniforms. They have this youth army now that learns about World War II and so on. The state has funneled all sorts of money into movies that are funded by the government, Hollywood-style movies about World War II that are I've watched several of them. I mean, yes, every big budget movie in the West or in Russia or in China or whatever is kind of cheesy. When it's about history, you show your side often in a better light, not exclusively though, of course. But I mean, these are comically one-sided, comically unrealistic. But there's a political message there, of course. It's omnipresent more now than it was before. But the last time I was in Russia, a few years before the big war with Ukraine began, I was in a small village on the eastern shore of Lake Baikal in Siberia. There's nothing there except a ferry landing for people crossing the lake. And there's a giant billboard in the middle. I mean, it's surrounded by little wooden shacks, little small wooden traditional Siberian houses, a dirt road, unpaved, stray dogs, picking at stuff and barking at me. And there's a huge billboard saying, remember the children. And there's this big picture of like evil looking Germans and an innocent looking Soviet child. I mean, how is that relevant in a tiny village, impoverished village in the middle of nowhere in Siberia in 2018? Right? So the depth, the presence that World War II is kind of being pushed in today's Russia, more recent years, is extreme. And it's only, of course, grown since the war began.
Absolutely right. And it's interesting. You mentioned that we might have to look at the current situation a little bit. So let's do this very briefly, where we're supposed to be talking about memory and also World War II, but it fits in really nicely. So just briefly, when you look at the rhetoric that comes out of Russia talking about the Ukraine at the moment. So first they're talking about, sometimes the Jewish aspect. You look at Zelensky, for example, of course, who is Jewish, but then also they call them fascists. And that is really interesting. So why do the Russians call the Ukrainians fascists? Again, when you think that the president actually is Jewish, it doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. When you start rewinding and you go back to the perceived history, i.e. the memory of World War II, suddenly it does make a lot of sense. Because first of all, you already mentioned it, you had some collaboration. You had collaboration in the Ukraine. Even today, Ukraine is kind of divided between the East and the West. You know this far better than I do. You go there far more often and you've got links to the Ukraine. But when you just look at some of the partisan groups that you've got there hailed as heroes in the West, basically seen as traitors in the eastern part, particularly the parts that are now under occupation. So there's the struggle there. And of course, the other thing is the internal aspect of this. The moment in Russia you say, we are fighting the fascists, we are fighting the fascist beast, this immediately takes people back to World War II. So here's an expansionist power backed by probably another power, i.e. America or the West, whoever that might be, and they want to take over. They're just as bad and evil as the fascists, i.e. the Germans in World War II. And the moment you mention this word, all alarm bells go off in Russia, and everyone just basically gets closer together, stands together, because they know what this means. So the history of the Great Patriotic War, with all its perceived lessons, the great losses, and everything that plays a role here, is absolutely crucial to the internal semantics, the internal story in Russia when it comes to the war in the Ukraine at this very moment. So this is really a very, very strong example. On the other hand, it's also interesting, having talked about fascists a little bit, that every time I went to Russia, I never had a bad word from any Russians. Quite interesting, because you might say, like it happens in other countries, like, for example, even in the UK or other Western countries, oh, Germans, no, don't want anything to do with them, all Nazis, evil people, go away, blah, blah, blah. That still happens. In Russia, that never happened. They made a very, very clear point. I thought that was fascinating. Very small one, but semantically really important. They always talked about fascist Germany or the fascists, but they never said the Germans. And I thought that was really interesting. Goes hand in hand and stands in line with a statement by Stalin, of course, who said, well, the fascists, the Nazis and the Hitlers, they come and go, but Germany will always remain as a country. You can put another layer on it as well, that is then to do with, well, the fact that to communists, of course, countries didn't really matter. It's more about class. It's more about belief, fascism versus communism. But I thought it was striking that even today, at least personally, I've never had a bad word from a Russian about history. You came here, you invaded our country. Because of that, we lost over 20 million people, complete devastation, not a single bad word. Very, very different quite often still today in Western Europe, for example. Very, very interesting.
I would venture to suggest that today, as opposed to the last time either of us were able to visit Russia, things have probably shifted to some extent. The public rhetoric from the state, from state television hosts or what have you, what's being required of teachers in the education system and all of that is really quite extreme, and it bases a lot of it on World War II. So there's this idea that Russia's historic mission is to fight Nazis. Right, so there's that's our reason in history in the world. So what do we do if we're fighting someone? Well, they have to be Nazis because that's the opposite of what Russians are, because that's what World War II taught us, right? So there's this enlisting that in a black and white sort of Manichaean, is a bit of a fancy religious word for that. It's one or the other. It's good versus evil, and it's seen through that World War II prism. Never mind that in Ukraine, the far-right party got less than 2% of the vote in the last elections, doesn't have anybody in parliament anymore, and so on. Never mind all that, right? Never mind that Ukraine's actually a democracy, Russia is not, and so on. They have to be the Nazis because we're fighting against them. And you can see that filters down. I've seen all sorts of interesting interviews, but also pictures and videos of Russian troops who have sort of decorated their tanks with Soviet flags, who've painted on the side of their tanks in Ukraine to Berlin, right? Even though obviously they're not attempting to get to Berlin. They're having a hard enough time getting to Kiev at the moment. Obviously, we'll see how that plays out. And there's this, even before the invasion of Ukraine began, Russian nationalists adopted certain slogans like, we can repeat, we can do it again. And what they mean is, we can defeat the evil Nazi West again. We can make it to Berlin again if you choose to put that on your tank, right? So this is common public discourse now. And I mean, the point of this podcast is not for me to dump on Russia's policy decisions. Of course, I'm against their invasion of Ukraine. But the point is to emphasize that they're using World War II to justify it. That's the key thing that we're talking about with memory here. And they, again, emphasize the fact that some Ukrainians collaborated with the Germans, some fought against the Germans and fought against the Soviets, which is also a betrayal in the Russian frame of mind. And they ignore the fact, of course, that several million Ukrainians supported the Soviet Union in the war, fought in the Red Army. But now it's all these fascist traitors. That's the legacy of Bandera, who was a Ukrainian leader in World War II, independence leader who sort of worked with the Germans for a little while until they put him in prison. But they're Banderites, according to the Russians. So there's an immensely powerful enlisting of World War II on the current day actual battlefield in Ukraine. It's something that I've studied a lot with propaganda in historical context. And now it's very strange to see it playing out. You know, priests are saying, yes, God wants you to go to war to kill these Nazis. So you're mixing the Orthodox traditions now with the Soviet World War II achievements. It's quite an interesting thing. I don't think we've seen this kind of memory war in a very long time, at least since Stalin's time.
And isn't it fascinating? That goes all the way back 80 years to the end of World War II. So you could choose something else in between. I mean, that's a long period of time. But no, you can't, because this is still the defining moment, isn't it? So it's absolutely, absolutely fascinating to see how this country that went through all these ups and downs and upheaval in all its history is still circling around the history of World War II. And of course, let's face it, in many ways, you might say, as a nation, as a country, not for the individual, but as a nation, it really was the glorious moment, because they, in their self-perception, defeated the largest enemy, the largest army, the largest military in the world. So this is something to be really proud of. But of course, it also means you must forget about all the suffering that occurred. A lot of it actually occurred because of bad political and military decisions taken by the Soviets themselves. But that, of course, is not talked about, because that's nothing to do with defeating the fascist beast. So that's a very different matter. But I know, Jesse, you had another point that you wanted to raise.
Yeah, actually, two quick ones. One is, I think one of the reasons why they haven't found another historical event to give meaning to since World War II is because if you look at the history of the Soviet Union and then current day Russia, there are slim pickings. Okay, they put a man in space, but you can't hitch your horse to that in the same way you can to World War II. So I feel like part of the current move back to World War II is because this expansionist warlike project is what's supposed to give meaning, and World War II can support that. And one example of that is this tradition that existed in Russia for several years called the Immortal Regiment. It started as like a grassroots commemoration where people whose fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers fought or died in the Second World War would have a little parade with holding the pictures of their relatives. And so the idea was this, we are carrying on the tradition of them. And it's sort of this regiment of relatives who will never die because we're perpetuating their memory. It was a grassroots thing. It started in Tyumen, I think, and was in Tomsk, another small regional town. But it got made official. It got state support to be done in all the cities across Russia, starting in about 2012, right after massive protests by the opposition. This is back when there was a political opposition. So if you're the Putin regime and you think, well, a lot of people are unhappy with us, we need to consolidate, well, everyone's going to rally around World War II and our greatness, so let's push that even more. But what's interesting as well for that is they banned it in 2023. The very parade that they pushed to unify the people, they banned it because they were worried that people would start carrying the pictures of their relatives who've been killed in the war in Ukraine. And they didn't want to publicize the cost of that war. So there you are again, another case of remembering and forgetting at the same time, which of course all countries do. Russia's not unique to that. And on that note, let's switch countries here before this becomes a 2-hour podcast. We promised the US and the UK for this episode, and come hell or high water, we're going to make it. So Matthias, take me away from Russia. I'm very passionate and very interested in historical memory in Russia, but we've got to leave it.
Well, unfortunately, we have to. You're absolutely right. And it's a shame because Russia really is fascinating, and everything to do with Russian history is absolutely fascinating. And I honestly think that we in the West don't understand enough about it. And that is a real problem. Because if you want to understand what happens in Russia now, as we've just discussed, I think you need to understand the memory of World War II and of other events. And I'm not quite sure if we're actually getting this right in the West, which I would argue has led to some interesting policy decisions. But that's a different discussion. So where do we go from here? We've got two countries. We've got the UK and we've got the US. So we need to find a link between the two, or between these three. But I don't know. Let's go to the US. And you were talking about cheesy films earlier, cheesy Russian films. So maybe that's a good link, because where do most of the cheesy films come from? Of course, from the US. So let's go to Hollywood. And actually, I'm just saying this half jokingly, because I think when you look at film production, just like in Russia that you mentioned earlier, it tells you a lot about perception. It tells you a lot about memory. And let's not forget that particularly in the modern times where people tend to read less and everything is more visual, these things are actually very influential. If you compare some of the old films, generally speaking, I don't know, let's talk about what's a good World War II film, The Longest Day from the 1960s. It's not only The Longest Day, it's also the longest film, I think, but it's a very good film. This one's actually very interesting because it's very balanced. You have Americans, even though they're not the right ones. So John Wayne is there and other people. Listeners, you might have seen this film. If you haven't, watch it. It's really good. Americans playing Americans, Brits playing Brits. Some of them were actually there during D-Day, and Germans playing Germans. And that in itself is actually quite good, because not only do these people get it, this was filmed in the 60s, so most people there, unless you were John Wayne, actually had served in the military. They understood how these things were done. And so that's a very, very good movie. It's quite balanced as well in the views. And then you fast forward, and you go to other films, like, for example, a film about a tank, which has a very famous American actor in it, which, who is the world's oldest sergeant you have ever seen. So this will never happen. And everything in this film is just wrong at every single level. And this is interesting because you'd think that, well, we've moved on from the 60s, let's say 40, 50 years forward, and things should become more balanced. But for some strange reason, they are not. And when you watch this film and lots of other films that have come out subsequently, they are really, really, really bad. So I actually, to be perfectly honest, I have stopped watching war films, particularly from America, if they were made after the 1990s. I simply don't watch them anymore because they wind me up too much. And it's just not worth it to get my blood pressure up all the time. And I think it's really to do with this. It's all about the memory. And you can see again how the memory has shifted and changed in America. And of course, in the American case, and Jess, you understand that far better than I do, you're not American, but you're from the same continent.
Thank you.
To us poor Europeans, you're all the same. You've got the same accent, let's face it. It doesn't. It's all
Do
the
not
same.
have the same accent. But anyway, go on.
To us, you do. Well, by us, I mean me, because I can't distinguish American accents. There we go. Where was I? I'm completely lost now. I've got no idea what I was saying.
Neither do I. I got sidetracked thinking of how I can teach our listeners, invite our listeners to write us explaining the difference between an American and a Canadian accent for poor Matthias. I think you were talking about...
I hand over to you because I completely lost my train of thought. So you're in the deep now because you need to rescue us.
complete break in the train of thought thanks to the accent question. No, but one of the parallels. Now you mentioned the cheesy Hollywood films. Of course, there are cheesy Russian films about it. I've seen cheesy Indian films about the First World War as well. So there's no end of this type of thing. Interestingly enough, French films are way less cheesy and much more thinky, much more introspective about the Second World War and the First World War as well. Recommend French war movies. I think they're among the best in that business. But getting back to the US, there is, I think, one parallel with the Soviet memory that I find interesting beyond the cheesy movies. And that is, it is considered, one of the peaks, historical peaks of the achievement of the nation. And there's a lot of attention paid to that as one of the primary achievements of the United States. Now, the United States has other elements of its history that they can draw on to feel good about their history and their nation if they want to do that. That's often what memory is about, not exclusively, whereas the Soviets had less. But World War II is definitely kind of in the middle of that picture. Not for nothing that they consider the greatest generation to be the generation that fought World War II. It's considered, the good war because morally it's not as mixed. It's not as easy to criticize the US role in World War II as it is, say, Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or these other conflicts that people lived through for 50 years, the last 50 years. The US has lived through those conflicts that I just mentioned, which caused a lot of self-doubt, which caused a lot of internal division. But then you can look back to World War II and say, yeah, but that one was where Tom Hanks was trying to rescue Private Ryan, and it was, good. Of course, actual World War II history is more complicated than that, but I think that's a big role for World War II in US history. And of course, then again, they overlook certain things, segregation in the army, in the military, the internment of the Japanese minority, breaking all, normal legal procedures. It doesn't mean you have to focus on those things, of course, but there's no John Wayne movie that would have that in it, for example, right? So there's always this process of including and not including. They totally overlooked the other allies. There's no question of that.
Who are they again? What other allies?
Exactly. The Who's, whatever. But this silly movie about the submarine U-571, I think it was called, where they showed in the movie that the Americans somehow captured the Enigma machine when, of course, the Poles got one and gave it to the Brits, who then figured it out. Nothing to do with the Americans. So this navel gazing is also not unique to the Russian case, and we do see it in the American case. That's just one example from a film. Have you caught up with your train of thought, Matthias? Can I chuck it back to you?
It's completely gone, but I just start somewhere completely. It's gone. I've got no idea where it is exactly. Probably, well, that train got blown up somewhere. I'm not quite sure what happened to it.
Partisans.
But there we are. Yeah, absolutely, partisans. But just to come back to what you've said, I think you're absolutely right. It's, of course, memory is always selective. And we've talked about this before, and you mentioned it in the introduction. It's not about what individuals believe. It's about what societies and nations believe. And, of course, you make a choice. It's a conscious decision that you want to remember this and commemorate this, but not the other bits. And, of course, for most nations, that means you want to remember and commemorate the positive aspects. You talked about it, the term the greatest generation, it's the good war. And why do you have to remember all these things? Well, first of all, yes, it is the good war, but also, of course, as you already mentioned, after that, from a pure military point of view, well, let's face it, it doesn't go all that well for the Americans. It's quite difficult to find a major war that the Americans really win from a military point of view after World War II. And by that, I mean really an important one. Right? Of course, the obvious one is Vietnam, and then you've got other examples. We don't need to go into this, but that's difficult. So the frame of reference, of course, is this. And this then overshadows, just like in the Russian case, a lot of the negatives that you find as well. You mentioned some segregation is a great one. Again, you watch films today, you think that half the American army consists of black soldiers. They were all completely integrated into the military structure. No, they weren't. It was a segregated army. It's actually one of the reasons why Hitler and the Nazis looked to America in the 1920s and early 30s and are quite impressed. Because, well, this is a country that's got proper segregation. We don't have black people, we've got Jews, we should be doing the same thing. There's a lot we can learn from the Americans. And they keep that, of course, after World War II. It's war crimes. The US Army commits a number of very nasty war crimes. No one talks about this. I've got a number of interesting examples where filming, for example, a colleague of mine, he went filming in Normandy and said, well, let's look at American war crimes. And the American film crew just basically refused to film. And I said, no, Americans don't commit war crime. The great generation never did this. And yes, they did, because it's war and these things happen in war. But it doesn't get talked about. So the problem with this is that it's then you take the skewed reality or this fantasy that you create, whether it's similar again to the Russian case, you might say, to completely different level. And that gives you a completely wrong perspective of history. And that makes it really difficult to understand how things have evolved and how things have happened in the past, and also to analyze why these were happening, because it's all about the big why question, isn't it? And I find that in the US, to be perfectly honest, this why question doesn't really exist. To me, perfectly, it's always summed up very nicely by, for example, US military cemeteries, particularly when I compare them to other nations' cemeteries. And by that, I mean mainly, in this case, actually mainly the Germans, because the German one, dear listener, if you haven't been to a German military cemetery, go there. It's very dark, it's somber, it's gloomy. It basically, for a better phrase, speaks to the German soul. And this is not a Nazi thing. The design had been there before. And then you go to an American one, which is very grand. It's white, it's shiny, huge American flag. I personally don't like the American ones. I find them too shiny, too glorious. I'm missing the aspect of the suffering. It's all about, as a bit in the British case, where they talk of the glorious dead. Yes, they're glorious, but they're also dead. I'm not quite sure they wanted to die. So maybe that's another side that might or should be remembered, but this seems to be completely taken out of this part. And again, my personal view on this is this: you can only in inverted commas afford to do this if you have two things. The first thing is you need to be victorious in war, and America was. And the second thing is, statistically, your losses need to be quite small and low. The moment you have mass casualties, whether it's civilians or whether it's military personnel, you see these things very differently. But when you look at the actual losses of the US forces, they are very low compared to other nations, and also, of course, compared to the wider population. Still, everyone who dies in war is one casualty too many. But when you compare that and see how this impacts the general and national memory, I think here's another way to explain all this. Because let's face it, well, most people in the US weren't directly touched by World War II. So I think here are two aspects that are very important to remember. I'm not quite sure how you see that, Jesse. Do you think I'm completely wrong here and we've lost all of our American listeners now, which is quite possible.
Those are two different questions. We might have lost all our American listeners. I don't think you're completely wrong. I agree in principle where you took your thoughts just then, but I would probably add a few caveats and maybe a few other points to consider in that. Not necessarily in defense of the US. We're not here to defend or attack any one country's history or memory or listeners, your personal idea of the meaning of World War II. That's not what the discussion is about. I will say that, US historians have investigated all sorts of different aspects of the war historically.
Yeah,
so there have been studies done about war crimes. There have been studies done about, segregation, Japanese internship, interning of Japanese Americans, and so on. All sorts of historical literature is there. It hasn't fully found expression in, blockbuster Hollywood films. It has found some in some other aspects of public history, some documentaries, museum exhibitions, that sort of thing. There are a couple films that I thought did touch on that element to some degree. Like I think Letters from Iwo Jima was an interesting, where they had these two films where you get the kind of Japanese side and the American side. I thought that was really, really well done, even though I haven't watched it in quite a long time. I remember being very impressed.
No, but it's very good, and you're absolutely right. And that's why it stands out as well.
Yeah, I'm actually going to cite now a movie that I hate with a burning passion, but there's one aspect that I thought it tried to do something useful, and that is Pearl Harbor. One of the worst war movies that I've ever seen. But they did try to show there were black servicemen. They did contribute. I think the portrayal of, Cuba Gooding Jr. shooting down planes at Pearl Harbor and stuff is a little over dramatized.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is a film. And they did try to show some aspects of the segregation, but that there were African Americans present and so on. So, it is a bit of a mixed record. It's not a one-way trip necessarily. Two films that I really think encapsulate some of the state of the US mindset, let's say, because that's always what determines your memory choices. How are you doing today determines how you look at the past to some extent. If you look at Saving Private Ryan, it's a very heroic movie. The Americans are, of course, the good guys. All the characters are kind of lovable in their own way. They're taking care of each other. You have kind of Private Ryan, who's sort of this innocent, young America figure in a way, who's being saved by an older American father figure, whatever. This is in the 1990s when the US is at its peak. It's triumphant. It's just won the Cold War. It's very confident in the righteousness of its cause, defeated the Soviet evil empire. And so the movie comes out in the mid-90s. It's the 50th anniversary of D-Day and 50th anniversary of the end of the war. Lots of commemorations around that. And you have this sort of feel-good, we're the good guys, triumph human story movie. Then you have a movie that you obliquely referred to about tanks called Fury, where the characters are more mixed. They're not all nice guys. They shoot some Germans. They have a very callous, some of them, approach to war and death and killing. They're not sort of all morally good or whatever. And I think this reflects then the US mindset in the 2010s, where they're questioning, they're not as confident, their society's a lot more divided, not only about its history, but about its current politics. And I feel like maybe I'm overanalyzing a little bit, but I feel like a bit of that subconsciously influenced the portrayal in something like Fury. So in the US, you can also see these changing aspects of the memory, what's emphasized, what's not. I'm not a huge movie buff, but movies are useful to get the pulse of the memory at the time.
No, I think they absolutely are. And as I said earlier, well, particularly in these days where everything is far more visual than it used to be. So this is really, really important. And it is unbelievable when you talk to students or other people, and they actually think what happened in all of these films that you mentioned, where this is or this was reality, and this is exactly what happened.
Heaven help us.
Exactly. All these films drive me up the wall. I mean, the worst film, not the Second World War one, so I'm not going to talk about it for very long, is the latest All Quiet on the Western Front. So I've got no idea.
Controversial one.
But it's absolutely It's shocking. But that's a completely different story. We shouldn't go there because then we're now venturing to two of our sister podcast, of course, which is dealing with the First World War. So yes, it's all very complex. It is difficult. I think you're absolutely right. Of course, you've got, again, just like in Russia, as we said earlier, you've got, of course, these different movements in countries. And it is difficult because you really have to distinguish between the personal memory that people have and what a nation on the whole makes of it. And that is really difficult because nations, I mean, what does that mean? What is a nation? It's quite diffuse, isn't it? So, but there are these tendencies and you can see how these shift and change. And quite often, as you've said, using the examples of the films, that is linked to current political events. And I think that works quite well. There is perhaps, and this is now very, very clever how I make this link, dear listeners, there is perhaps one country, I would say, where it doesn't really go up and down with these different trends in memory. At least I would argue, but I would say it's quite steady, and it's to do with the fact that really after World War II, this particular country has been, and this is also how it's been perceived, pretty much in steady decline. And that, of course, is the UK. It is in the words and the wording. It's quite fascinating. When you look at World War II and people say, well, 1940, the Battle of Britain. Britain standing all alone, which, by the way, is not true. Different matter again. But this is it. And this was the finest hour. This is the finest hour of Britain. Think about the Air Force pilots. They saved everything. And this is Britain's finest hour. Well, what people, I think they're probably right, but what people tend to forget when they say this is that if that's the finest hour, everything that comes afterwards is not as fine. And of course, in Britain, people know this. They know that after that, Britain has been on a decline. So the empire disappears, economic pressures. You actually have rationing in Britain longer than in West Germany after World War II. What does that tell you about the state of Britain? Britain being the sick man of Europe in the 70s and 80s. You then have the small peak of national pride, which is the Falklands War. After that, again, it's downhill, downhill, downhill. Let's not go into politics here. Let's not talk about Brexit, but I think that's also linked to it. I remember seeing posters up. You talked about posters in Russia. I saw posters up in Kent. Vote for Brexit, otherwise we'll have the Fourth Reich and the Germans will have won. These were posters that went up in Britain during the time of the Brexit vote. So it's completely mind-boggling. But I think it's to do with this. Deep inside, there's a very, very wounded soul in the UK because people know, well, there used to be an empire. It was the most powerful country in the world. And then even though Britain was, I wouldn't say won the war, I would say was on the winning side. And that will get me a lot of flack already from British people because most Brits think that Britain won the war. So that happened, and still there is this steady decline, economic decline, world power decline. Britain is no longer a great power. It's really difficult. So how do you overcome this? By going back to this really, really fine moment. And that also means that, for example, there is, I would say, a very unhealthy obsession with everything Hitler in this country. I had a friend of mine called me not long ago. He said, I think something's really terrible has happened. I said, what's going on? And he said, well, I've been watching telly for the last 2 days, history documentaries. Hitler wasn't on. Has something happened to him? And I thought it was really funny because, well, because normally there's Hitler, World War II, World War II, World War II, which of course also a very British thing because Brits don't like confrontation. So what you do is you don't say, well, we are the best. But what you do is you say the enemy, they were extremely good, but we won anyway. So indirectly, you tell the world that you were better, which it's a very British way of doing business, I would argue. The indirect approach, not only in the military world, but also in society.
Liddell Hart.
Exactly. So it's a very British thing, even in society. And I think it's a very, very good example. So you can see, as I said, a wounded soul, which is desperately trying to find something to cling on to and to use this phrase, to make Britain great again, if that is the right phrase here. And with that, over to our North American.
Indeed. We are plunging off the deep end in this episode. We're going places where we've not gone before in the podcast. But I think that's important because historical memory is relevant, and the study of history is connected to its uses in the current day. So it's not just something that, we dust off and it's in the archives and it stays in the past. History's alive, it's with us. we choose how to try to understand it. We choose how we allow our politicians to use it to motivate us in this way or that way. So I think it's worth it that we're sort of flying very close to the sun for a history podcast for today. But one of the things that strikes me about the British memory of the war, as I perceive it as an outsider, listeners, I'm not trying to speak on your behalf if you're in Britain, right? Is that a lot of it has to do with the civilian experience, and not as much of a proportion has to do with the actual fighting. It's a bit more abstract. So there's this idea of the Blitz Spirit where everyone kind of bands together and carries on, like all the merchandise now says in the museums and so on in the UK or online that you can order, just keep calm and carry on and so on. That there's this idea that, Churchill plays an outsized role in their memory, far more than like FDR plays in the American memory, for example. Maybe partially even more significant than the role that Stalin played in the Soviet memory for a long time, especially when he was out of favor for several decades. So Churchill's quite central, and his speeches are quite central, as you referred to. This idea that everyone was doing their bit. And I was interested to read that there aren't as dramatic shifts, I think, in the memory as in the case of Russia or the US. So I would agree with you on that score. My understanding is that there are some sort of little spikes or little shifts in the British memory over time. And I wanted to throw a few out on the table for our listeners to think about and for you to respond to. One of them is that in the post-war decades, part of the motivation to rebuild British society, to rebuild quality of life, to build a more fair society, right? The British state, doesn't matter if the Conservatives or Labour are in power, the British state intervenes massively in people's lives, in the economy, to build housing, to have better pensions, et cetera, employ people by the state, all sorts of state involvement, like a welfare state project, in order to get people out of this awful economic bankrupt situation that Britain found itself in. And so part of the use of World War II is then, well, we went through that terrible experience. We suffered. More than 300,000 of our countrymen died. We bankrupted our country. We lost our empire. But now we're going to have a better life. And so World War II kind of served that purpose. We all agree, or most of us agree, that we want to reorganize British life in a way that's more fair for everyone. And then you have a bit of a push towards national solidarity, national greatness, a little bit in the Falklands, as you mentioned, right? So we won World War II. Now, Argentina has occupied one of our territories, and you see a little spike in commemoration in the 1980s. And as far as I understand, some of these narratives become a bit more influential, of Britain alone, the Blitz Spirit, kind of a little bit more deliberate from the Falklands. And I'm glad you mentioned Brexit, because I definitely feel, this happened in my adult life, so I could observe it in real time. I definitely feel that there is an uptick, and was an uptick in, World War II. We were alone then, and we saved the world for that one glorious year where we held off the Axis on our own. So we should be on our own again, and we can take on, all comers, should there be any, on our own, even if we leave the European Union. So I think there's a couple of more subtle shifts, let's say. I don't know if you're on board with that, or you see it differently.
No, I think you're absolutely right. When you talk about building a fairer Britain, just look at the elections in 1945. Churchill, the big winner of the war, basically loses the election, and Attlee comes in because he makes this promise: "You've all fought. We need to have a fairer society." And then you've got the National Health Service and all these things coming in. So there's definitely something there. Let's also say that Britain, of course, started from a very, very low starting point, because it still is today, and even more in those days, a very class-based society, which we then talk about. The Blitz Spirit, I think, is very, very important. There is the story that the royal family were very, very happy when one bomb was dropped on Buckingham Palace, because finally now we can go to the East End and show our face there because people have been bombed there. By the way, the Blitz, of course, is not a drop in the ocean, a bit more than that. But when you compare that, of course, to the bombing in Germany, it's a completely different story. So in a way, kind of basically blown out of proportion, because it is so important for the social cohesion. That's really it. It's not about the destruction of London. It's about the social cohesion. So that's a really interesting point. And then when you move forward, it's interesting that a little bit like in other countries, the further we move away from the war, the more important it seems to become in national memory. Just look at the commemorations that are currently happening, have just happened. The 80th anniversary of a battle is suddenly something big. It never used to be. It's 25, 50, 75, 100. And after that, everyone tends to forget. But 80 is basically nothing. Now they say, of course, this is the last time you might have some veterans there and all these things. That's why it's important. But it's really interesting. Take one example, the Battle of Arnhem. Huge event every year. It's getting bigger and bigger. The army getting involved. The chief of the general staff, the British army being the first one to jump out of the plane and a parachute. A concept I'll never quite understand why you jump out of a perfectly fine working plane, but that's a different question. So that's happening, and that's interesting as well. Why are they doing this? And why are you choosing particular battles that are important? Well, the Battle of Arnhem, let's face it, is a defeat for the British. They lose a division. So it's a massive defeat, and yes, it is celebrated.
Dunkirk as well.
Dunkirk as well, same thing. It's really, really odd. And then on the other hand, they make it out like it was the biggest battle in World War II. No, it's not. To put that again, this into context, I talked about casualties and the link of casualty to memory earlier. So if you compare what happens to the British in Arnhem, this is what happens to the Germans on the Eastern Front every single day. They lose about a division. If you just look at the number of casualties. And again, you can link this if you want to the overarching casualties of a nation and what that means. And again, every casualty is one too many. But if you put that into perspective, it tells you a little bit about the national approach to these things. Britain, for example, in World War II loses 450,000 men. That's about 370,000 military personnel, and the rest are civilians. And you're absolutely right, I would say, that civilians get a lot of attention, and rightly so. And again, it's because of the social cohesion question. Just take this number, 450,000, and compare that to one or two other nations. Give you perhaps the most obvious and striking example. The German Wehrmacht loses 450,000 men in January 1945. The German military loses the same amount of people in 1 month that all of Britain loses during the entire Second World War. That tells you already a bit about why other nations do things differently. Then put on top, we've talked about Germany before, I don't have to repeat all this, that of course they lost the war, the Holocaust and all these things. But this again shows you it's a very, very different approach. And you can bring this forward when you look at how people are remembered, commemorated even today. So people, British service personnel, for example, who've died after World War II, and I was looking up these figures, all of the people taken together that died in British military service from 1945 all the way up to today, is the same amount of Germans dying on the Eastern Front in World War II in one single day. Again, each casualty is one too many, but it shows you something. So if you've got relatively low casualty numbers, you can, in inverted commas, afford to have a different approach to these things. And that, of course, again, means the slightly more heroic one. I personally, and I know this is a very, very British thing, so don't get me wrong, British listeners, but I always find it slightly cheesy when people say, I have written this book, I have made this, or I dedicate this to my great uncle who fought on the first day of the Somme or in World War II. And they get very excited about this. Whereas to me, having grown up in a different system, you don't even talk about these things because that's very natural. Everybody lost people in a family. If you haven't lost anyone in World War II or even World War I, you are the odd one out. In the UK, in the US, you are the odd one out if you've lost someone. Yes, lots of people served, but not a lot of people died. So you can, in inverted commas, again, afford to have a different approach. Not quite sure if you agree with this, but that's kind of, well, it's a broad topic, but some of the general observations, again, we can drill in a bit more and take this apart.
Well, I mean, I partly agree. I see that the degree of loss can have an influence on commemoration culture, commemorative practices, how one thinks about it. On the other hand, the Soviet Union lost even more people than Germany, and they're big on the heroism myth. Differently than...
Because they also won. They won. That's, of course, the big difference.
Right. They also won, of course. Yeah, so there are some different variables, right? They don't do it the same way exactly as the Brits and Americans do. For example, the lovely individualized cemeteries, lovely from my point of view. I do feel like there is something deeply meaningful about the way the Americans and Brits have chosen to organize their cemeteries. There's a disadvantage, of course, that it sanitizes it somehow, which I think is kind of partly what you were getting at. But I also think it makes it very meaningful and it's very respectful to do it that way. I feel that way about it, maybe because I come from the Commonwealth culture of commemoration. Whereas, of course, the Soviets, they do have some individual graves, but the vast, vast, vast majority were just tossed into mass graves. So there's differences there as well. In the British case, I also want to get back, before we wrap things up for today, I want to get back to this idea of the remembering versus forgetting or not emphasizing, because the Brits do this, of course, as well, right? So the solidarity of people, the common suffering of people in the Blitz is something that's emphasized for reasons that you talked about as well. But the tensions between different British people about wealth giving you access to better shelters during the Blitz, or black marketeering, or the increase in like juvenile crime during the Blitz, because of course orders sort of breaks down. You can go out when people are supposed to be in the shelters. So all these things happened in a big city of several million people, but it's kind of papered over because it's not that useful, politically speaking or socially speaking. Same thing, Dunkirk, Arnhem, and Normandy and the Battle of Britain get the kind of emphasis, whereas Burma, North Africa, and Italy and the naval war don't get as much emphasis, right? They're not a glorious defeat and they're not a glorious victory. They're long and grinding campaigns. The victories are sort of maybe questionable as to should those campaigns have been given the resources or not, and so on and so forth. So there again, it doesn't quite serve that same dramatic memorial purpose. So that's one of the other things I think about when I think of the British memory. Is there anything else that you want to tack on to this mega episode that we've had today so far?
I think that's more than enough, because the listeners will probably have had enough of memory in different countries by now. Just maybe one point, a very, very short one, just relating to your very last comment. I think you're absolutely right. When you look, for example, at the Battle of the Atlantic, I think in my eyes, the guys of the Merchant Navy, the British Merchant Navy, are the unsung heroes of World War II. No one ever talks about them. They get the smallest memorials. They never get mentioned. And I think what they did was absolutely outstanding and extremely brave. And I think that is enough.
I absolutely agree with that point. There's no question there. So, folks, to very briefly summarize a wide-ranging talk that we've had today, we again talked about historical memory. That means the cultural understanding of the past, the political uses of the past, separate from the pure kind of historical research understanding of the past. We talked about the Soviet Union and Russia, especially how World War II is being used as a way of justifying the current war against Ukraine. We talked about the US and the Greatest Generation being a high point for US memory that sometimes comes into question in more recent years of political division. And we talked about the UK and the idea of this social solidarity, and then more recently emphasizing the ability to go it alone when the UK's political situation then changed during and since Brexit. So just a reminder to our listeners out there, none of this is like a moral judgment on your memory and your understanding of the war. There can be many different elements to what we talked about today, and it doesn't mean that we're condemning one, except probably the Russian-Ukraine war, but I don't think we have many Russian nationalist listeners, or there can be a different interpretation. In fact, I think that's one of the strengths of our societies in the former Western Allied countries, is that we won that war, and so we can talk about these things and we can discuss what meaning do we want to have for World War II. And on that note of hopefulness, let's say, in these very strange times, we'll leave you for today, listeners. If you have a comment, if you feel like you want to let us know what you thought of our discussion today, send us a message, let us know, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
to go back to the name it had in World War II, to the name. Sorry, that's the phone. Every year it goes back to being called Stalingrad. So bloody. It goes. Hang on, I unplugged my phone. Hang on.
Curse of modern technology. God, that was I love this memory stuff.
Isn't it funny?
Oh God, it's so interesting, dude. I like those. I like those memory ones.